Okay, well, thanks very much, Rich, and thank you and the organizers for inviting me. I'm really excited to be able to participate in the conference today and to have the opportunity to talk to you on the topic I entitled Restoring Environmental Services in Disturbed Compacted Urban Soils. That's a little circuitous of a title, but I really come to this topic originally from a stormwater perspective, and I know for many of us, we think of stormwater as a problem that comes from impervious areas. If anything, the soil, the pervious landscape is the solution to our stormwater problems. But what I will try to talk to you about and hopefully convince you is that in much of the built environment, the pervious landscape really suffers a legacy of disturbed, compacted urban soils that affect not only stormwater runoff, but the ecosystem services we expect from healthy soil profiles, nutrient processing, carbon sequestration, and so on. So for some of you, I hope that poses an interesting question and makes you ask, why would I say that there's a pervasive legacy of disturbed compacted soils? I hope for many of you, the answer is pretty obvious when you look at this picture. I like to show this, and I've shown it many times, because for me, it encapsulates the sort of archetype of modern land development, where a convoy of earth-moving vehicles strips vegetation, topsoil, does cut and fill mass grading to bring the land surface to the contours defined by a landscape architect, compacting that soil in place for stability, before putting in underground utilities and curb and gutter drainage and homes and foundations. And then the last step is to, if you're lucky, spread a few inches of topsoil on the remaining unpaved surfaces to support vegetation. I like to show this little monadnock of soil. And if you think of the 4 or 5 feet of soil that's still left here, that represents roughly perhaps 18 inches of water holding capacity. That's not going to be just diminished by compaction, but is going to be extirpated, is going to be removed. So our modern standard practices of land development, I suggest to you, are performing a very efficient infiltrationectomy on our landscape. They are removing infiltration capacity before we can even think about whether or not we might want to manage stormwater on site with rain gardens or bioretention structures or any of the BMPs that were mentioned in our earlier session. This is a typical picture from commercial development, but a similar picture from a residential site that Tom Whitlow and I used to visit on our lunch hour when Tom was on his sabbatical leave at UMBC. And here you see a lush verdant cover of turf grass growing in an inch of topsoil cut from a sod farm that's been placed over this morass of compacted fill. You can grow a perfectly acceptable vegetative cover in an inch of topsoil. It has very little water holding capacity or plant available nutrients, so you have to conscientiously water it and fertilize it. But the real challenge is it only takes a few tenths of an inch of irrigation or rainfall to saturate that soil layer. And there is so little vertical percolation that once that soil becomes saturated, this pervious land use is behaving like an impervious surface. So our modern land development practices have, in a sense, decoupled the form and function of the landscape. You can no longer look at the quality of the vegetation or view aerial photographs and determine if the soil profile supporting the pervious landscape is a deep, uncompacted soil profile that allows deep, dense root masses like those here on the left, or if we're trying to grow grass in a thin veneer of topsoil on compacted fill, like these little muffin tops shown here on the right. We were stunned when we took these cores in a field just outside my office on the UMBC campus. And I heard a wonderful phrase, non-functional turf, this morning that was new to me, but it occurred to me that from a hydrologic perspective, soil profiles like this are supporting non-functional turf that doesn't have great hydrologic services. And looking back on the left, this is a slope failure on the edge of an athletic field on our campus. But what it revealed is two things, really. Number one, you often hear people still invoking the idea that all turf grass is shallow rooted. Well, some turf grasses are, but for example, turf type tall fescue, which is the recommended cultivar here in Maryland, is perfectly capable of growing deep, dense root masses like this if the soil is not compacted beyond the growth limiting bulk density. And you can see the rooting depth here is limited by the depth to the interface with this massive compacted fill. Excuse me. Again, we can't reliably predict function from form. We need to do on-site investigations. Part of the reason for that is because compaction in the land grading and development business is viewed as an asset, right? Compaction is literally referred to as ground improvement because it adds load-bearing strength to support building foundations and roads and our buried underground utility without slumping. These graded slopes on the cover of the Los Angeles County DPW grading guidelines contain very specific recommendations on the minimum amount of compaction that's required in building up a landscape like this. And this landscape is built in 12-inch lifts. So it's amazing to think about the minimum compaction if you're only going to build up 40 feet of this material, and the higher level of compaction required if you build up above 40 feet. An important, I think, picture to keep in mind that when you're thinking about these vast thicknesses of engineered compacted material that are routine construction practices, when we talk about soil services, whether it's infiltration or carbon sequestration or the organic soil ecosystem processes at the root zone, they are not happening in material that is this compacted. Now, this is only part of the landscape, and this kind of compaction really is important for both slope stability and in California, something that we don't think too much about here in Maryland, seismic stability, but important to recognize that on these type of engineered constructed landscapes, there are very serious risks and serious geotechnical considerations that have to be considered. Still, these don't represent the whole landscape, and there are certainly other parts of the landscape that don't require this level of compaction, but where this kind of compaction is still occurring simply because it is a standard construction practice. And that's exactly what we've seen in our work here on the East Coast, and I suspect you see on the West Coast as well. So we've asked the question, just how compacted are urban soils? We've sampled over 300 residential yards, 75 vacant lots, a number of athletic fields, and the take-home message is that the vast majority of the urban soils we sampled have a bulk density that's greater than what we call the native bulk density. That's the bulk density we would predict based on the texture and organic matter alone. And the majority of those soils actually have a compaction level in which the bulk density is more than 10% above native bulk density. Now, if you don't think in terms of bulk density, you might say, well, what difference does that make? A 10% increase in bulk density, that doesn't sound like that much. But this figure on the bottom part of the slide shows the standard soil ternary diagram with the familiar soil texture categories outlined in blue, on which I've superimposed contour lines showing the percent reduction in infiltration capacity that we might expect from a healthy uncompacted soil if it's compacted just 10%. And for the clay loam textures, we expect a disproportionate reduction of infiltration from anywhere from 25 to 40%. For the loamy textures, a 10% increase in bulk density might be expected to reduce infiltration capacity from 45% to over 65%. So there's a dramatic, disproportionate loss of infiltration with the first increment of compaction. And the reason for that is that healthy soils are more than a mixture of sand, silt, and clay particles. The soil particles form aggregates or PEDs. These are the soil crumbs you see in when you dig a healthy soil, or the water stable aggregates. That's a very common excuse me, soil health test. And those are the particles, those aggregates determine the pore size distribution, particularly for the macropores. And it's those interconnected macropores that support infiltration. It's also those large interconnected macropores that are the weakest pores in the soil and the first pores that are lost with even a modest level of compaction. And when I say modest compaction, I'm not talking about a few passes with a bulldozer. I'm talking about, your brother-in-law parking his SUV on the lawn when it's wet during Thanksgiving or Christmas. It doesn't take very much to get that first increment of compaction, and it has a disproportionate effect in reducing infiltration. So what can we do? We've been looking at a series of decompaction and amendment practices that we've called suburban subsoiling to acknowledge the analog to agricultural subsoiling practices that are used to break up plow pans that limit root growth for crops. One of our projects was a wonderful partnership on an elementary school in Baltimore City between Baltimore DPW and the Board of Ed, in which Baltimore, like Los Angeles and every other large city, has a federal stormwater permit for their storm sewer discharge system, and they get credit for impervious area removal. So the city is going back to old public schools, removing asphalt playgrounds like that one on the left here, and replacing it with grass. And on this one, we were able to partner with the city so that half of the site was vegetated with standard topsoiling specifications, exactly the specs that are put out to bid from the city spec book. On the other half of the field, we were able to implement our suburban subsoiling practice, consisting of deep ripping to break up the massive blocky structure of the soil with aggressive organic compost incorporation. Here's just an example to give you a sense of what we're talking about. The contractor actually had access to agricultural tillage equipment, so he brought out a big honking 250 horsepower John Deere tractor that was able to pull 5 ripping blades at one time, again, shooting for a target depth of 20 to 24 inches, followed by surface application of 3 inches of compost that we tried to incorporate to a depth of 9 inches, looking for a 2-to-1 soil to compost ratio on a volumetric basis. And after this was done, both sides of the field were hydroseeded with the same seed mix at the same time. Just 9 months later, we saw a dramatic difference in the quality of the turf, where the standard topsoiling field had really uneven, thin turf cover with lots of bare spots dominated by clover and crabgrass, whereas the suburban subsoiling field had a very dense, thick, verdant cover with more than twice the standing biomass of the standard topsoiling field, and was growing deep-rooted, drought-resistant turf. And we attribute that entirely to the difference in the soil profile between the two sides of the field. It's important to note these are both zero input turfs. There is no supplemental irrigation or fertilization here. The only grounds management practice is periodic mowing with the clips returned to the grass. And you can see the dramatic difference in a very short period of time. The proof, I think, is in the long-lasting effects. 4 years after this treatment was done, actually, these are year 3 results that I'll just go through quickly, that we see dramatic differences in the bulk density, much higher organic matter, breathtakingly higher infiltration rates, more than an order of magnitude improvement in infiltration, and higher plant available water. And the difference we attribute entirely to the change in the soil profile. These dashed lines, these are cone penetrometer profiles measured in units of millipascals, or the pressure it takes to deform the soil. These dotted lines denote the range below which most vascular plant roots have little trouble penetrating the soil, and above which most vascular plant roots are not expected to penetrate at all. So we consistently see a much deeper threshold before plant roots are impeded compared to the very shallow rooted turf or vegetation we grow with standard topsoiling specs. 4 years after treatment, I went out to this site on a Sunday afternoon when we were having a 24-hour rainstorm in the spring of 2014. And this storm delivered 3.2 inches in 24 hours, which is almost the textbook definition of our 2-year storm. On the suburban subsoiling half of the field, you see 4 years after treatment, very uniform dense cover, but more importantly, no sign of ponding or puddles, no rills or concentrated flow, and obviously a very different perspective, which again, from a hydrologic perspective, I might start calling this non-functional turf, non-functional pervious landscape. And our estimate is that this half of the field is producing more than 30 times the annual runoff as our suburban subsoiling. So clearly a superior sustainable turf cover, one that can pay for itself with reduced irrigation and fertilizer costs and anywhere from 9 months to a few years, depending on how you establish the turf. But ironically, there is currently no incentive for the contractor, the developer, or the landowner to implement this practice. And the reason for that is the credit is currently being granted not for the amount of runoff reduction achieved, but for the removal of impervious area. It's simply the absence of imperviousness. So we've been working with the state of Maryland, our Department of the Environment and DOT, to develop a quantitative site-specific stormwater credit. And we actually have a complete protocol that's about to be made part of the state MS4 accounting guidelines for people in the regulatory world. But by providing a credit for this enhanced performance, analogous to some of the credits that are offered in Los Angeles' Safe Clean Water program through the flood control district, this is one way to incentivize developers and contractors to respond to offering this as a cost-effective service. I want to wrap up by just addressing the question, should we really be that concerned about compacted soil? After all, won't these soils heal themselves? So I love to show these pictures on the left of the historical trails of westward expansion, where on the Santa Fe Trail out in the Kansas prairie, we have very, very detailed records of the 4,000 kilogram wagons full of potbelly stoves and plow blades that were hauled across the prairie by teams of 20 oxen until about 1865, when the first rail spur was completed from St. Louis to Santa Fe, and suddenly all the traffic on the Santa Fe Trail halted. Today, 150 years later, in the Kansas prairie with frost depths to 90 inches, and prairie vegetation with 20-foot deep roots, this soil is still too compacted for any vegetation to grow. And I wanted to show these pictures from a contractor, a landscape contractor, who is trying to do this practice on a mitigation site for an interstate highway project here in Maryland called the Inter-County Connector, who bought this lightweight ripping blade, had never done this work before. And within 30 minutes of starting to rip, you can see the blade started to get twisted like a pretzel, and the reinforcing plate that had been welded to keep this in place had the weld fail. So I like to show this picture and just keep these in mind the next time you hear people talking to you about deep-rooted vegetation that's going to decompact our urban soils, or how urban trees are going to pry apart these deeply compacted soils. Some modest levels of compaction can be recovered, but on human timescales, the intense kind of compaction that we have on these historic and the intense compaction we see in the built environment is not something that's going to repair itself naturally. This kind of very significant intervention is required, but it can be done quite cost effectively given the benefits that ensue. So with that, let me wrap up by just saying, I hope I've left you with a somewhat persuasive opinion that there is a pervasive legacy and an opportunity to deal with disturbed, compacted urban soils, but also that these occur in the landscape, the urban landscape, not because of incompetence or fraud, but rather as the logical, rational, inevitable response of contractors to the current standards and specifications they're being given. So it's feasible to restore this. And if we want different outcomes, we need to change our standards and practices and come up with credits to motivate landowners. And we can do that by aligning the incentives for contractors by writing the right specifications, aligning the incentives for developers by offering stormwater and other credits, and the incentives for owners by helping them understand the life cycle cost savings from building sustainable landscapes. But doing that, we can really avoid and reverse the legacy of compaction in the urban landscape and enrich that portfolio of sustainable services in urban landscapes. Let me wrap up there and leave you with this idealized cartoon of the kind of disturbed, compacted profiles I think we are routinely producing as a result of our current standards, and the deep, porous, permeable, organic, rich, biologically active profiles that we can easily establish on the right lands, not everywhere. This is not a one-size-fits-all practice, but matched to the right situation where slope stability and seismic risks are not a concern. This is what we can produce in our urban landscapes. And I went over a little bit, so forgive me, Rich, but I'll stop there.